Hello, everyone, and welcome to LGBT Lives in the UK. My name is Yen, and I'm from the Pink Singers, which is London's LGBT plus community choir. For those of you who are joining us now, it may be a bit unusual that an LGBT plus choir is hosting a talk on what life in the as an LGBT plus person here in the UK is. But it's because we have been involved in this ongoing project with our fellow choirs in Eastern Europe, notably Voces Gaudiae, based in Warsaw, and a choir called Obocina, based in St. Petersburg. LGBT plus lives in the UK is actually the third in a series of talks that we've been having. So last August, we had the first talk about LGBT plus lives in Russia. That was a very informative conversation that we had with activists over there. Also, I think quite distressing in many ways. And then in November of last year, we had the talk LGBT plus lives in Poland, where members of Voces Gaudiae told us stories of their experiences being Polish and also LGBT, and what it was like both in the rural and urban settings. And I personally found that very emotive, and it also really connected with me just to hear the stories of people's lives growing up, and sort of identifying that there were sort of several commonalities as well. So the advantage of, I guess, of being in an LGBT plus choir is that we have a very wide range of perspectives. And so we're very fortunate today to be able to hear some of those perspectives. For this talk, we actually polled the choir and asked them what challenges they faced, or where they felt the issues were, being LGBT plus and British at the same time. And this talk is therefore a little bit of an outcome of trying to sort some of the ideas through, and we've very loosely aggregated them into three different sections. So the first section really will be about sort of what it's like in a place where LGBT issues have largely become part of the mainstream. So it's quite different from the experiences in Russia and in Poland. And for that, I'm joined by Lynn, who is a former chair of the Pink Singers, and by Simon, who is the community's team lead for the Pink Singers at the moment. Welcome, Lynn and Simon. So I just want to start off, yeah, I just want to start off really by asking you, kind of making a comment really, that from the outside looking in, and I think particularly from people in, say, Warsaw or Russia, looking at the UK, it seems that, we're green on the ILGA map of LGBT rights in Europe, whereas those places are tending towards red. And so it seems fairly idyllic, and we have so many sort of legal equalities. And from that perspective, there is, I guess, the tendency to say that most of the important battles have been won. What is your perspective on that? Maybe we can start with Lynn.
I'd say that we're on the outside, it looks like we have rights and it looks like we're in a good position. But the reality, especially in the pandemic, is that we're not. 1 in 4 of the homeless people who are young are LGBT, because they've been thrown out of homes. The Albert Kennedy Trust, who support young people who are LGBT, have seen a 71% increase during the past year in requests for their service. We still have conversion therapy in the UK, and it's still promoted. And even though they're looking to get rid of that, that's still there. And also there seems to be a real U-turn in the government, that we have an equalities minister that isn't really looking at equalities, especially in education and inclusive education. And then as a bisexual woman, there is still the massive stereotype of sexualizing bisexual women. And I've had to fight 2 cases at work from managers who have basically, I've done an article for, I was the chair of the network as well, an article on being bisexual. And from that, they took that as a red light, that meant I'm attracted to everybody, including them. And so I still face those particular issues. And then we have a real problem in the community with the split between part of the LGBT community not supporting the other part of the LGBT community and not supporting our trans siblings and non-binary siblings. And you can't have rights for one when you don't have rights for all. So I think we're at the process of almost going backwards a little bit rather than forwards at the moment.
Yeah, I have certainly been reading a lot in the last week. I'm on holiday at the moment, so I've got a lot of time to sort of look at the press. And there is a lot of focus at the moment on that sort of division between trans rights and feminism, which is actually very challenging. And a little bit unfortunate, because you're right. I think solidarity and standing up for the most oppressed should be part of the LGBT plus movement, and it should be intrinsic to it. Simon, you've been involved in a lot of conversations recently around some of the challenges, particularly around, for instance, Pride. What's your take on the issue?
Yeah, so I think just to following on from Lynn's point about challenges within the community, and I think that's a really important one, because if within our queer community we can't support each other, we're really failing, because there's enough battles we have to fight externally and without fighting amongst ourselves. And I think some people on the call, but not everyone, may know that Pride in London, which is the organisation that organises London Pride, has been through a significant number of challenges this year. And the community board of London Pride resigned in mass protest because they felt that the organisation was institutionally racist. And it's interesting that Pride in London, an organisation set up to celebrate queer LGBTQ plus life and to continue to fight for rights, in itself as an organisation has serious problems around governance, racism, bullying, before we even talk about other issues within that organisation. And I think that probably comes as a shock to many people. So whilst I want to talk about and celebrate how life in the UK has changed for me as a gay man over the last 30 years that I've been out, and I come from a place of great privilege in terms of my rights, perhaps compared to our friends in Warsaw and Moscow, but there is still a fight to go here. And I think the Pride in London work really focusing on that. And later this week, the Pink Singers will be issuing a public statement that we really do struggle with where the Pride in London organisation is. And I think I can announce this: for the first time, we won't be marching, despite the fact we've marched every year in London Pride. That doesn't mean the Pink Singers will not continue to celebrate Pride more generally, celebrate the successes in the UK and around the world in terms of queer rights, and continue to fight for those. But that organisation at the moment isn't one we feel able to support when institutional racism drips through it, and those challenges still remain to be solved. That may be a very different battle to a battle that you're having in a small village in Poland or in Moscow, but it's still a battle.
Yeah, thank you very much, Simon. I think that Pride is, as a concept, is a wonderful thing, but how it's implemented can make very significant differences to the messaging that comes out. From my perspective, I've often seen Pride as always somewhat revolutionary, and it started out with obviously, Stonewall wasn't the start of it, but that's an abiding image that one has when it comes to Pride, and sort of challenging existing sort of constructs around what is normal, what is acceptable. I guess the initial sort of prides were really about sort of that, they were about revolution and about sort of taking down sort of the existing heteronormative ideas. Do you feel that we have, as a community, perhaps lost some of that revolutionary verve, Lynn?
I don't think we have. I think there's a resurgence, if anything, because you have to look at local prides. I come originally from a small village in Yorkshire, and the nearest city was Hull. Hull has prides, but it didn't used to. They're still new. We went to Croydon Pride with work for the first time last year, and it still had the real local feel and the real campaigning and the real, we made, you know, there are pockets of that. Unfortunately, because hate crime has also gone up in the UK massively. And the benefit is we are protected by law, but the fact that it's happening and increasing happening is incredibly worrying. And my experience as a bisexual woman in London is a very different experience than I would have in a different place in the UK. And in London, there's an additional privilege, to be fair, in the certain areas that you're in and the communities that you're from. But that isn't the same everywhere that you go within the UK. And I think that's something that we often forget as a community. But yeah, I think there is a new generation of people who still feel that there's a fight to be had and are still wanting to be there to do that. And it looks potentially like we're going to have one coming, the way it's going with the political side of things in the UK. And there seems to be two messages. At one point, we're holding a conference about LGBT life and how wonderful it is. And on the other point, we have decided not to continue with the LGBT rights we were going to be putting through in Parliament. So there seems to be this real dichotomy through. And that seems to be a problem, I think, going forward.
Simon, I want to ask you about what you think the impact of COVID and I guess more generally the rise in sort of populist politics has had on the LGBT community and how it's affected you and perhaps how it's affected your observation of the community as a whole.
Gosh, a very big question. I mean, I think from a personal level, you know, I can openly talk about mental health challenges through the COVID crisis. But I think, you know, it is that sense of community that we all deeply rely upon. And I have spent more time at work on Zoom in a very heteronormative community and far less time connecting with my community. And the support I get from my community, whether that's being with my fellow Pink singers, you know, or going to a gay bar or being on talks like this is something that you can't underestimate. And I think I went through a phase in the middle of COVID really where I simply didn't want to do anything, engage with anything. And you know, that's still a challenge. And I think I think about you know, the journey I've been on, and I look at kids who are trying to come out, and I imagine how hard is it when you don't have that support network. And I went to school in Oxford, which is a, you know, pretty well known but smallish town, and being in the gay bar there in the late 80s, 90s, you know, as a young person coming to terms with my sexuality, there would always be people coming in, teenagers who had been kicked out by their parents, or this was their first way of understanding queer life. And for the last 2 years, people haven't had that opportunity. And I think the belief that now there's the internet and you can talk to people online and you've got dating apps and you've got everything online, that means that 14-year-old boy or, you know, that 13-year-old trans person who's trying to work out which way's up, that they've got all these resources. I don't think you can beat people feeling that they are with other people in the same way. And we have been robbed of that during COVID. And I really hope that we find a way to get that back, because we are a family, we are a community, and that's where our strength comes from together.
Thank you very much, Simon. What I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly play a song as a kind of an interlude now between this and the next section. But I want to say, first of all, thank you very much to Lynn and Simon for joining us for that initial talk about the mainstreaming of LGBT issues and what challenges we still continue to face overall. Okay, well, so this next section is really going to be about intersectionality. And one of the challenges I think that we need to talk about as an LGBT plus community is that the benefits that have accrued for many of the people in the LGBT community here, well, largely the largely gay white men has not been adequately distributed to other members of our community. And so we want to talk today a little bit about some of the intersectional experiences within the LGBT community here in the UK. So let's start off with I want to start with Philip, because if you look at some of the photos in the previous video, you'll notice that Philip was there marching away at a variety of different prides and waving the flag for equality. Philip, tell me what does intersectionality mean to you?
Right, hi, thank you so much for inviting me to speak. Hi, everyone. For me, intersectionality means that people experience the world differently according to various things like their class, their race, their gender identity, their sexual orientation, their religion, and so on. And I realize that, as a gay white male, I can't possibly know what it's like to be a black trans woman. So the important thing for me is to recognize that everyone is different and to actually listen to other people's point of view. And I think, my feel is you do not expect people to, with other life experiences, to support your cause if you're not prepared to support theirs. And I kind of learned that from, my 50 years in the Gay Liberation Front. I was lucky enough to be in the original organization. And one of the things that we were very aware of was the importance of the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the Black Power movement. So already, our fight for freedom was linked to other causes and other minorities. Do you want me to talk a little bit more about that?
Philip, I just wanted to talk to you about the kind of activities that you're involved in now, particularly around older people in the LGBT community. I think I think there's the perception that the LGBT community is largely made up of younger people, but there are obviously different needs that arise as one gets older. Do you want to talk to me a little bit about what you've
Sure.
been working
It's
on?
really interesting because the Gay Liberation Front has kind of had a revival in the last few years with the old veterans, and there are about 20 of us still around, and a lot of young people. And we have really come together again because all the things that, in fact, Lynn was talking about that are carrying, one of the big risks, I think, that we've been mainstreamed to a certain extent, but at the expense of what I call a heterosexual approach. So one of the people who is was very much part of the early gay movement was Ted Brown, who was a person of color, a black man from New York, and one of the few people of color who had a voice in the early GLF. And his partner recently was put into a care home and experienced bullying and discrimination. And when we looked into it more carefully, we found there were over 50 cases reported in the last year. And those were only the ones that were reported, whereby elderly LGBT people were discriminated against in care homes and in government policy. No account was taken of the different needs of LGBT people. And indeed, in some cases, even our legal status wasn't recognized. Civil partnerships were not noted, or marriage. So partners were often not given access to their civil partners or their married partner. So what's happened is we've written to the UK Department of Health demanding answers to what they're planning to do to address this, and to ask them to bring in a policy specifically targeted at help for elderly LGBT people. And in the middle of last month in May, we actually went out and demonstrated outside one of the Department of Health buildings, because waving placards and screaming our tits off, if you excuse the expression, means we get a bit of publicity. So that's our campaign, one of our campaigns at the moment. And I'm delighted to say it's not just the old veterans who are supporting it, but the young LGBT youth as well.
Excellent. I think there's still so much more that needs to be done, and I think as we experience different things in different groups, we sort of recognize that there are multiple challenges that exist, and particularly how LGBT identity intersects with other identities.
Indeed.
And speaking of that, I'm just going to sort of highlight Sam now. Sam, you're kind of like the diametric opposite of Philip. Do you want to tell me about your experiences?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Cian, for having me here today. Yeah, I think for me, with the question that you posed earlier about intersectionality, I think some of it, some of what Philip has said also does resonate with me in terms of the fact that it's about recognizing that I hold many different identities, not just as a queer woman, but also as an East Asian, and in the UK especially, somebody who is an immigrant. And so how all of those things sort of collide in different ways, um, and affects the way I perceive myself, I perceive others, and also how I am perceived. And I think in the last couple of years that I have spent in the UK, as well as going back to my home country in Singapore, I do recognize that these things also sort of shift. For example, I hold much less privilege, or I face certain levels of discrimination being Asian here that I don't face back home in Singapore, where in a way I have so much privilege because we are the majority race in Singapore. Chinese people are the majority race in Singapore, and there are some other ethnic minorities that face a different level of discrimination. So it's sort of it's a little bit difficult to define sometimes because that changes so much geographically as well.
Thanks very much, Sam. Actually want to be to now talk to sort of Kunda, because Kunda, in some ways, your experience is similar to Sam's in that you're both an immigrant and also of an ethnic minority, but you've had the experience of being LGBT both in your home country and then coming to the UK, where I understand you're seeking asylum. What is that experience like for you to be here, and also compare that to where you're from?
Well, thank you for asking me that because I thought you wouldn't want me to talk about where I come from. Um, I feel like it's something that really needs to be looked at from outside the UK and when you're in the UK. I'll start from outside the UK. Boys like me growing up from a community in Zambia that does not actually tolerate such things. It was very difficult, where you don't even have to choose the right color or the kind of shoe that you want. They'll tell you, no, don't touch that, don't do that. That's for girls. That's for So you get confused as a child. You why not that? I can have that. It's different from here. And then at the end of the day, you are left in a place of solace, and you feel like you're rejected. You get isolated, and then it makes you grow up sad, so to say. That's why when you come here, you find that life is a little bit open. Even though I should think that still, given that privilege, I feel like the process must be studied, the structure must be well organized, because as a gay man, you're suffering from two things when you're here. Number one, well, you suffering from homophobia. That's the first thing, and then there's the issue of race as well. So you feel like there's a little bit of racism, not only widely in the around your surrounding, but sometimes you can actually also find it within your little groups that you belong to. And if someone if someone snaps at you, it brings you back. So I feel like it's very important. We need to start. I support the idea, even though many people support it and some don't. I feel like we should really find a way of infusing it and trying to make everyone understand that we're all important. We want to live together. You find that gay people or the LGBT community is more peaceful, actually, and we here, we all need to feel free, and we don't feel like you're in the center and everyone is bashing you and you can't express yourself. So, well, that's how I look at it. In short, it's
Thank you very
that
much,
way.
Kunda. I just want to ask you really a little bit about sort of whether the Black Lives Matter movement has affected you, and if so, in what ways?
Oh well, this as a big thing. Um, it's like that. Though now that something like that has happened, you feel like people are beginning to realize that all lives matter anyway, you know, and because I'm black and I'm stopped by the police, I shouldn't really feel like they're against me, you know, though in some way many people think that they're stopping me because I'm driving this fancy car, and because I'm black I'm not supposed to drive it. I feel like people must come to a place where they should know sometimes the police are doing their job. There's some bad cops out there, but some police are just doing their job. Because recently I was reading about something. It was Akon. If you know Akon, he stopped at a gas station and and he was putting petrol. He forgot to lock his car. Someone just got in his car and drove off. You know, so such things you wouldn't blame the police if they keep doing checks. But in a place whereby that court rule that went on during Black Lives Matter is very, it took a long time because it's got both parts, you know, of people supporting that and people supporting this. But I'll just think that we should be accepted either way. I don't think that any life really matters more than the other. All lives matter and we should treat each other the right way.
Thank you very much, Kunda. That's really interesting. I'm going to quickly show a video now, which is actually a performance of Kunda's group. So Kunda is from a group called Rainbows Across Borders, and he's the musical lead for Rainbow Singers Across Borders, which is the choir that is made up of members of that group, and they are LGBT asylum seekers who are fleeing persecution from oppressive homophobic and transphobic regimes. So, Kunda, I hope this doesn't come as a surprise to you, but we're going to be playing a short clip from the 2016 Croydon Pride. So this last section of today's sprint through LGBT lives in the UK features people who identify perhaps not with the sort of the two big categories, L and G in the LGBT plus umbrella. I just want to sort of say that I've also been reading in this week and listening to lots of conversations around what the right terminology for our community should be. And some people prefer the use of the word queer, although there are historical pejorative reasons why we don't use it here, particularly in the UK. But in a sense, it becomes a little bit more inclusive because it doesn't specify specific identities. LGBT plus tends to lump a group of identities into the B, T, or even worse, the plus category. And it seems that it doesn't fully address that kind of inclusion, particularly now that we are more aware about the spectrums that exist across sexuality, gender, romanticism, all of these different sort of variables. Perhaps the best person to talk about this is Avi, who is the chair of Bi Pride UK. Avi, do you want to tell me a little bit about what it's like to be bi, or however, in the sort of the non-L and B part of the LGBT umbrella?
Sure. So one thing that I actually think is quite amusing is that this section's been entitled Minorities Within Minorities, but in actual fact, most statistics suggest that the bi community is actually the majority within LGBT spaces, and probably always has been, but definitely doesn't get that voice and doesn't get that recognition. And all the more so when you start to drill down into kind of different intersections between bi and other identities as well, of asexual and the identities under the ace umbrella, aromantic and under that umbrella as well. And sort of the more you think about the identities of the public eye, the further you drill down, the more you get to some of the really insidious hate and marginalization. Lynn talked a little bit earlier about the hypersexualization of bi women, but there are so many forms of stigma and of marginalization and of discrimination of bi people and anyone under the bi umbrella, anyone attracted to more than one gender. So it's that sort of parallel experience of knowing that actually there are more of you out there that could take on the L and the G if we had a street fight, and we'd outnumber you by a lot. Not that we're going to do that because we all love one another, but knowing that we have those numbers, and it's not passive, it is active trend to remove us from those spaces. The organizer of the first thing that was actually called a pride, obviously Stonewall riots were part of the history as well, but the first thing that was actually referred to as a pride was organized by a disabled Jewish bi woman. And Brenda Howard, her name was. She's completely written out of most public knowledge and understanding of pride history. And that's really, I think, quite telling of how much the world wants to recenter primarily cis white gay men, but also kind of there's the sort of hierarchy of, you know, if you're a cis white gay man, you're right at the top, but if you're a cis white gay woman, you're pretty much up there too. And there's a lot of statistics as well that sort of show how far behind on bi inclusion we actually are in comparison to other groups. There's Stonewall recent data that says that I think it's I can't remember the exact number offhand, but it's in the teens of percentage of people who have a visible bi role model that they can point to in work, but also kind of in the wider sphere. And that's then compared to in the 60% of gay men and gay women. And also when you think that the first time that bi people were protected in law from discrimination was the Equality Act in 2010. So you think back to kind of how we kind of talk about, you know, 67 as being that landmark moment for inclusion and understanding and anti-discrimination in queer spaces, but actually that was just some gay men. And when you think about how much more there is under the surface and how little it's recognized, it becomes very worrying. And that bi people have only been protected in law for 11 years now. And I think it was 2-3 years ago that biphobia was recognized as a specific form of discrimination under hate crime. So it's the steps are so much further behind, and yet our groups have been there from the beginning. Our groups have been part of the struggle from the beginning, but have been actively written out of our own story. So there's a lot of work to come, and that's only just talking about bi issues, without even beginning to touch on how we intersect within that, and that bi people are more likely to be disabled, are more likely to have mental health issues. There's some interesting studies in the US that suggest that there are more, I'm not sure if it's more non-white bi people than white bi people, but it's more likely that your identity will be under the bi umbrella if you're a person of color than if you're white. So there's so much intersectionality within bi spaces. So I can talk forever about bi inclusion, but I don't represent the entire community, and I have to kind of recognize that although there's so much exclusion of bi people, again, if you're white, able-bodied and cis and bi, you're at the top of the pile again. So there's that need to recognize the minorities within the minorities within the minorities within the minorities, and you can go all the way down till you get to the turtle and keep going. So yeah, that's probably enough.
Thank you very much, Abby. That was a very comprehensive look and a very brief but very comprehensive look at what it's like to be bi here. And I would just want to say, that I think that the work that you're doing at the moment is really incredible in creating the spaces and creating the platforms that allow for bi visibility, which is sorely lacking at the moment. If we could move down to Sel now. Sel, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what it's like for you living in the UK?
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting what Avi just said about people under the bi umbrella actually possibly not being a minority within the LGBT plus community. And I like the term queer because it feels a bit more like it covers a spectrum rather than individual identities. And for me, it feels more comfortable than saying I'm bi or finding another word to kind of describe my sexual orientation or even my gender identity. But in my experience, the label LGBT plus in kind of conversation is often seems to be interchangeable or synonymous with gay or lesbian, sometimes lesbian as well. And that's where the more I've kind of probably in about the last 5, 6, 7 years, I've come out as a trans person and non-binary and become increasingly comfortable with my own identity and secure with who I am and more open about it as well. But alongside that, the more I've kind of been living, in my own gender identity, and the more open I am about it, the more I realize, or the more I feel invisible within general kind of society and life. And every day things happen that I just feel, that I'm excluded from that, or it's I think just the way our world is organized, and I feel like all aspects of life, whether it's culture, sport, TV, or the law, education, healthcare, everything is gendered to some extent. Even something simple like I really like going to the first thing I was asked when I went to check out was, are you male or female, or choose one of these titles, Mr., Mrs. Ms. So I end up usually pretending I'm a doctor because that's the only yeah, it just feels like every aspect of life, to some extent, you feel excluded from, or you just feel that you're not represented, you're not visible, or you're just expected to kind of make yourself fit in to one of the two genders. And in terms of legal recognition, it feels like we're just a really long way from where we want to be. And it just feels like the government are saying it will be too much admin to legally recognize who we are, and that's obviously very upsetting. And it feels like we're a long way from changing that.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Sal. It can't have been easy. And I've been reading in the press this week about Stonewall and their statements, and it must be terrible to hear about the kind of discrimination that is stemming from members of our own community. I think that's the part that I find it distresses me. So it definitely must distress you. Charlie, I'm going to invite you to talk about your experience as an NB person. What's that like for you?
So I mean, as with Sal, it's hard every time I just had to apply for a new passport. And it's sort of every time I have to fill in any sort of form from the government or anything like that, I feel like I'm being forced to commit fraud because I can't be honest about who I am. I'm having to slide myself into one of these boxes that don't fit with who I am. It feels like I'm lying and like I'm being forced to lie by my own government. Sort of, I'm bi, as with Avi, bi, trans, disabled, and I think one of the things that I've really noticed is sort of pushing on for coming up 20 years of activism. Is when I first got involved, it was sort of equal age of consent, and then it was civil partnerships, and a lot of sort of my early activist work was UK issues, and then we kind of got to 2010 and we got equal marriage and all of a sudden the focus shifted to international stuff. We were looking more at sort of LGBT refugees, LGBT rights internationally, and then all of a sudden in the last sort of 3 years or so it's flipped back. But it's flipped back on trans stuff. It's all of my activism now is based around trans issues in the UK. I'm doing work on the LGBT Alliance getting charity status, challenging the Charity Commission on that. I've been involved with, I'm part of Stonewall's Trans Advisory Group. I'm the trans rep on my staff LGBT forum. I'm the trans rep and a trustee for the local, for my borough's LGBT forum. And so all of my work, all of my activism has suddenly flipped back, and I'm trying to support the international stuff still, but I'm finding less and less time to do the work, and more I'm just throwing money at the problem. Micro Rainbow International supports LGBT refugees in the UK, so I'm donating to them. I'm donating to a South African friend. I'm supporting her financially. Her and her daughter. It's that sort of thing. I'm vice chair of the Liberal Democrats LGBT group, and again, what I'm noticing is all the trans people are working on the trans issues. And Lib Dems are currently doing a thing on LGBT rights in Poland called Protect Our Twins, which is looking at sort of working with cities and towns in the UK that are twinned with cities and towns in Poland. But all of the people working on that are gay men. All of the people who fit into the minorities within the minorities, women, bi, trans, we're all still having to focus on the UK stuff because that's our fight at the moment. That's what we're fighting on, because it's rolling back and rolling back and rolling back. And there's this sort of mythical idea that there's some conflict between being a feminist and supporting trans rights, and gender critical feminists are not feminists. They're just as reactionary, just as transphobic as everyone else. They're working with, you know, right-wing anti-abortion groups in the UK. They don't care. And that's it. That's what I've mostly noticed is that flip between we thought we'd solved everything, and that sort of things would just sort of we'd tick forward, and everything would keep ticking over nicely, and maybe we'd have to give the government a little prod for specifics, but by and large we would go, actually, can you ban conversion therapy? And they would go, yeah, sure, no problem, and it would get done. And we're finding more and more that actually we've got a more regressive government, and that's not the case. And those of us that fit within the minorities are having to spend all of our emotional energy on not losing the rights we've already fought for, whilst a lot of our, and I'm going to say it is gay men, a lot of our gay male siblings are not experiencing that battle, especially white gay male siblings. So we're having to leave them to do the international work because we don't have the time and the energy to do it in the same way that we were doing it anymore. And that's great if we're all working together. Like, God love the Alphabet Mafia, which is my new preferred umbrella term. You know, so if we're all working together, then that's great. And you know, the broader shoulders can take the most load. If you've got less fight to do for your personal rights, you can take on the extra stuff, and that's great. But I want to be able to fight for everyone. I don't want to constantly just be fighting for me to exist safely as a human being. I thought I'd done that. I thought I'd fought that fight, and now all of a sudden it's round two.
Thank you very much, Charlie. I think what that highlights to me that first of all, solidarity is so key. That, you know, we have to identify, and that there are challenges that other people face that we can actually take a stand on, and that which we actually have an impact on. And that is partly to do with this project itself. It's about sort of standing with our colleagues our comrades in Warsaw and in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Okay, so now is an opportunity for us to sort of ask questions. We have a question from Joanna from Berchtesgadia in Warsaw, and she says it's so terrible to hear the experience of being forced to get over it and just pick one. I think that's in response to to Sel's statement about the boxes that you have to kind of tick in terms of identifying your sort of the gender. The being overlooked part is very hard, even though as a cis L woman we surely don't get it fully, but it's still infuriating. Currently in Poland, we have a national census, and despite interventions of many NGOs, trans and non-binary siblings who haven't changed their gender legally and gotten a new personal ID number, they can't even get noticed by the statistics. Maybe that's a little conversation that we can have around sort of the census that has actually just taken place. Avi, what's your stance on how accurate you think the numbers are likely to be?
So that's an interesting one, because there's been a lot of discussion about what data is actually being captured by it, because there's a big difference between behavioral identity, sexuality, and sort of presentation. So there are a lot of people who might be, for example, behaviorally bi. They are attracted to more than one gender. They date people of more than one gender, but don't necessarily identify as being bi. They might use no label. They might kind of consider themselves to be straight or gay, but, you know, occasionally dabble in another gender. So the amount of people who might identify as bi is going to be really different to the number of people who are actually in some way behaviorally under that category, and absolutely no forcing of labels whatsoever. The label people use to choose for themselves is what they absolutely should. But it means that there's going to be a lot of unseen people from the perspective of kind of sexuality. and also a lot of people who sort of have felt forced into ticking the box that says bisexual, even though they use another identity under that umbrella as well. And sort of, you know, people have just been like, you know, just stomach it and put it, even if you identify as pan or as polysexual or any of the other identities under the bracket. And other people saying, no, I don't want to be forced to. I know that it would help with the data, but I'm still not going to tick a box that doesn't feel right to me, that says who I am. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what data comes out of it, both in terms of sexuality and in terms of gender identity, where we've been allowed to put non-binary for the first time, but that data isn't backed up by anything legal because of all of the reasons that the government have turned around and said, no, it's too much effort for us to recognise you. So I think there's going to be a lot of extrapolation that needs to happen from the data when it is finally launched, which is probably only going to be like 3-4 years from the next census, to be honest, because it takes them so long to process it. But yeah, it is going to be really interesting to see what it comes through, but very much a pinch of salt, I think.
Right. Does anyone want to add anything to that? Charlie?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other issue is that we know that sort of younger people are more generally willing to be out and open about their sexuality, but the census sexuality and gender identity questions were only offered if you're over 16. Now I have actually spoken with one of the census community engagement managers, and I understand the reasons why. They were worried about getting false data from young people not feeling able to be open about it on a census form, or parents taking over filling in forms for their kids, for teenagers. So they were worried about the data wouldn't be accurate, and they were like, we would rather have no data than inaccurate data, which I get. But at the same time, it's gonna impact on the data as a whole, because you can't say there are this many bi or gay over 60s and then extrapolate that down to 13-14-year-olds, because quite frankly, even if nothing else, you're looking at a situation in which, as a community, we've lost a lot of our elders. There is a massive gap of LGBT older people who should be there and aren't, and that's down to transphobia, biphobia, and and things like, and the AIDS pandemic, for goodness sake. We have a lot fewer older LGBT people than we should do, and we know this. So you can't extrapolate downwards in the same way. So not having that data feels like a massive misstep to me, but I don't see how we can get around it.
I guess just to add on to that as well, there's the data is backed up by ONS, the Office of National Statistics, over the last sort of 5-10 years has been collecting loads of really valuable data. But again, they've mostly been focusing on over 18s. And although the trend is very clearly that every time they do that survey again, more and more 18 to 24-year-olds are identifying as not being straight or not being gay. And there is also data suggesting, kind of gathered by sort of youth LGBT charities, that's suggesting that that trend is kind of continuing under the age of 18, but we are missing that gap. And if there is a trend, then that suggests that the older the current generation gets and the new generation coming in under it, the more people there are going to be identifying outside of the already represented groups. But if we're not collecting that data is not going to be used to reflect the services that we need to develop.
It's it's very interesting that commentary, because I do find that we like to use the word, I guess, LGBT plus or queer to sort of say that we're not cishet, but at the same time, there's a necessity to identify the subgroups within that, because the needs are not the same across the queer spectrum. Stephen actually asks, relevant to that, is if there are still many minorities being recognized, would an overarching campaign to remove the need for sectional labels be be valuable? And Philip, perhaps you can answer that.
Right, sorry, I'm just reading the... Yes, in a sense, a lot of the census, policy development and delivery of the issues, so, or the things that Ali and Charlie are saying are relevant in terms of that. I guess it's education too, that if you can't use the census material, you can at least lobby government departments. That's one of the things we're trying to do in the Department of Health at the moment. And the Home Office, for God's sake, is one of our biggest bugbears, to try and explain more carefully these issues. I don't think that certainly ministers or civil servants not also actually understand the subtlety of these issues, and we need to, I think, have an educational campaign. And Stonewall does very good work on that, although getting criticised for it, in order to explain what do we mean in terms of how the law operates and how our freedoms are enshrined in law, and that the discrimination is removed. What does that actually mean in practice, and how do we then prepare to deliver it, or get the organisations that do deliver it up to speed on that?
Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions they want to ask, especially the people from who don't live in the UK? I have just a quick question, and maybe I'm going to direct this towards Sam, because one thing that did come up in the survey that we did was about the relative paucity of LGBT spaces. I think there was a sort of an explosion for a while then in terms of community spaces, but this has now shrunk down to nearly nothing, and particularly for women's spaces. What kind of effect do you think this has had on people who identify as lesbian?
Right. So yeah, I feel quite, when I saw that, I felt quite sort of distressed, because very often, especially if, I think maybe things are changing, and I've noticed also with people who are even 5 years younger than me, that it's sort of easier to talk about your identity and everything. But for people who are discovering their identity, like say from their mid-20s and above, and are maybe surrounded by people who are cis or who are heterosexual, like that, those spaces are so valuable from a point of it's not just from the point of being around people who you can share this very big commonality with, but from providing a very important frame of reference for what your future could potentially look like. For me, especially, the Pink Singers was that space for me. Like I had known many queer people. Being out was a great way for me to also sometimes because I volunteer that I am queer, I then get to meet more queer people just because I am out. But I still never got to see beyond that little demo, beyond maybe people who are my age or be in my social circles, or who knows somebody else. I never got any idea of what maybe a middle-aged or somebody like in their 40s or in their 50s, what a queer woman looked like, what her life experience was like, and just where she was in her life. And so I think the limit, like that, having lesser sort of spaces allocated for queer women will result in a loss of that experience for a lot of people. And sure, it often seems to fall, like the burden often also seems to fall upon queer people to, people always say, oh, then just make the space, or then there will be sort of underground spaces. Like that is the way it is, in my home country, in Singapore, where if, when there is a lack of organized spaces, then there becomes underground things. But at the same time, it's like, especially if it is in the UK, it's like, why should that be the case? Why does the burden, fall onto some person to organize an underground thing and to then keep that going? Like, yeah, I think that's sort of the question that I still can't really solution to, but I definitely agree that it's a real loss.
Can I jump in there, Sian?
Yes,
Yeah, I would say that I've seen a shift. I remember the early days in the Pinkies. So I'm 42, so I'm in that middle age bracket. So if you want a conversation, feel free. And I like when I joined, I was like straight in university, and even then, it was really challenging to find spaces where the whole LGBT community could be, because it was very split then between very binary women, lesbians specifically, and men. And when I first came out, decided that I would try and be the term then was butch to try and fit in, which obviously I'm not naturally and didn't really work for me. But there are some interesting funny photos from that side. But there isn't the spaces, those spaces have now declined. And more the LGBT community is meeting by a shared interest. So a club, a sport, something musical. And that seems to be the spaces where there doesn't seem to be the spaces to go out. And if they are, they're often very much catered towards gay men. And obviously for a lot of women, they're often the caregivers still. So they're often the people that have families or look after the elderly relatives. It's not everybody, I realise, but that also then causes going out isn't the same sort of thing, because you've got to have spaces that are children friendly, or you've got to have spaces at different times because you might be doing care for an elderly relative and through. So I think the spaces haven't evolved, so that what's come into place has been what's there in the communities and people together. And I think that's been borne out by diva communities, who have done a great job online this year of actually being more diverse and welcoming of everybody, but actually providing support for people of different generations. Because one thing with the Pinkies is it's a family, and it's a family whether you've been a Pinky for a small space of time or for a long space of time, and you meet people from everywhere, from different generations, from the whole alphabet. But there are very few spaces like that.
Thanks, Lynn. I think we have a number of people who have their hands up. So we're going to start off with Misha.
Well, I might skip for a moment because I had a next question, but I think Avi and Charlie might have further comments on the previous one.
Okay, so let's start with Avi then.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to kind of add a point that sprung to mind while both Lynn and Sam were talking there, that there's also the issue of, so people sort of say, well, if you don't have a space, we'll make it yourself, no one's stopping you from making it yourself. Then you make it yourself and people are like, why are you separating yourself off from the community? Can't you just, be part of the big inclusive community? We're all in it together and we're all part of the community. So why are you separating yourself off? And then you say, okay, I'll come and join your community. And they'll be like, yeah, but you have to fit in with us. And there's just this constant cycle that's absolutely exhausting. Like, we get it all the time. We get asked why a bi pride? Why not just, come to the general pride? Because the general pride has bi people too. It's like, yeah, but you're not doing it right. So let us make our own space. We're still going to come to yours and we're still going to call you out when you do it wrong. But we get called out for having our own space. I know that UK Black Pride has had the same. I know that trans pride organisers have had the same. Like, whenever we create our own spaces, people who would never even dream of coming to our space because it's not their space tell us we shouldn't have our space. So there's just no way of winning.
Charlie, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, saying I became physically disabled in sort of about 2008 or so about 5 years after I came out. And my experience as a part of the LGBT community pre-physical disability and post-physical disability are worlds apart. Like there was always that gap as sort of the provision, lack of trans provision, but I never had a problem getting to things and being at things, whereas now sometimes it is so hard to get involved in things because pride, at the end of the day, pride is a 1.5 mile walk. Sort of pride is fundamentally inaccessible, and they've tried, past pride committees have tried hard to try and make it more accessible, but fundamentally it boils down to it's a 1.5 mile walk through central London. It's hard. That wrecks me for a good 4 or 5 days afterwards, and that's hangover aside. That's before we deal with the hangover. And one of the things I found is a lot of my straight disabled friends have found that actually the pandemic has really opened their world up because of the rise of working from home, Zoom meetings. They've actually found themselves able to do more. And a lot of my LGBT disabled friends have found ourselves able to do less because the spaces that we had created in the real world have disappeared. They've obviously closed. You know, we can't have them anymore. But we don't have the ability. We haven't got the ability. We're generally, obviously, disabled people are more likely to be unemployed, so we can't afford the premium Zoom account. So we can't have the unlimited meetings. We can't have meetings longer than 45 minutes. So our worlds have closed down as LGBT disabled people. And I am exceptionally lucky in that because I am a key worker, I haven't been stuck at home. I've been able to keep going to work, and I have a lot of LGBT friends at work. But so many of my disabled LGBT friends have found that their worlds have shrunk down to virtually nothing. It's sort of their immediate circle of friends. And I'm genuinely worried about people who have become disabled through having COVID, who have come out, young disabled people coming out in the world of COVID, that how do you access those spaces? And there were enough problems sort of for disabled LGBT people beforehand, in terms of sort of things that I've heard from previous work that I've had, are things like care workers coming into people's houses and praying over them, or disabled trans people whose carers have refused to dress them in the clothes that they want to wear, and insisting, no, you are a man, you must wear men's clothes. It's like, no, I'm a woman, I'm a trans woman, go away. And that's where my worry is at the moment, is that essentially we've got coming up for now 2 years where the spaces that we've created as disabled LGBT people, we've lost. And how do we get those back? Can we rebuild those? What's happened to the people running them? You know,
Thank you very much, Chan.
That community organisation we're losing a lot of it.
Yeah, it's definitely a worry. Misha, do you want to sort of ask your question?
Sure. My question was this: being realistic. I mean, we meet here as people from 2 different countries and contexts, and we are aware that you guys are kind of, with all the troubles that you've mentioned, and I totally acknowledge that they exist, you are still kind of 10 or realistically 30 years ahead of us, not light years, but years. And where you are around the corner, you can see probably some things that cannot be seen from our point. And I wanted to have maybe one of the last minutes of this meeting devoted to this. What does the future look like from your point on the journey? Is it brighter than you thought before? For example, I mean, some LGBT organizations openly say that our mission is to cease to exist, to stop being needed, because everything will be achieved and everything will be, everyone will, everyone will be equal and treated equally, and there will be no need to fight, and so on and so forth. And that's a question to anyone from the speakers.
I think that I'll go from my side. I think we've got a journey and we've got a little bit of a fight on our hands because we've got the step backwards that we've got. And I think that rights go in a cycle. So you often find a lot of rights happen, sometimes in a very short space of time after years of nothing happening. Then there's a kickback as from the people that are not going to be accepting of that change. Then there's a little fight again. And it's one of those spirals that ever diminishes down. So I think there will be a need, but the need will change. And yeah, somebody's put in the thing that it went back on Stephen, I think that it went back with US and Trump massively. So I think that, and they've funded a lot of campaigns in the UK, unfortunately, on that side. So I think there is improvement, there is a lot of hope, but it's a case of a diligent watch and making sure we continue. But you can take hope by looking at places like Malta that went from having nothing to being one of the best places in Europe for LGBT rights. And also you can have hope because of the European Union's work on having an LGBT charter across Europe and how that may help things going forward. So I think there's hope. I'm just not sure we're at a point where in my lifetime I will see no need for an LGBT group.
I think one of the things that comes, the more infrastructure there is around this work, the more risk there is also of becoming embedded in a bit of an echo chamber and thinking that things are better than they actually are, which sounds really dismal. But like there's definitely a sort of, especially sort of in the world of social media and kind of keeping the people around you who have the same opinions as you, there can definitely be a sort of feeling of, yes, we're getting there, because in the last week I haven't seen anyone post a biphobic meme, and then you're like, well, that's because most of the people in my social media network are probably bi. So being kind of quite aware of what the audience is to things, and it's horrible to read the Daily Mail and the Telegraph and all of those other ones, but sometimes you have to force yourself to read them to remind yourself that those views are still out there and that the work still needs doing in those parts of society, even if there are parts of society that you feel safer and comfortable in, because those are the parts that probably don't need as much of the work, or at least don't need as much of the top level work, but they've probably got all of the stuff underneath that needs unpicking a bit more.
I just want to add that I don't think that there's definitely a linear pathway that every country has to follow towards LGBT rights, and that, you know, the idea of being ahead or behind is a kind of it's a little bit challenging, because there will be different paths that different countries follow based on their local situation, whatever the local culture is, what the local sort of barriers are, and so there will definitely be distinct routes that groups go through. That said, you know, I am from Singapore, like Sam, and I grew up in a very it's not overtly homophobic, but there's a lot of systemic homophobia. Actually, when I was growing up, people used to be sort of exposed as being gay, and they would make it into the press, and it was pretty awful growing up being a gay man in Singapore. And so coming to the UK was a real revelation, and the ability to work without, and knowing that there are legal protections in place that don't discriminate against you, I cannot even describe to you what a relief that is for me. And that's why I really want that kind of protection to exist for other people as well. You know, if we talk about, I'm sorry, I keep on talking about things in a utilitarian perspective because I'm Singaporean. But, you know, it's really about sort of maximizing potential and giving everyone the opportunity to be their fullest selves. And if we live in a place where there continues to be restrictions for whatever reason, then you're not really, you know, giving everyone the opportunity to be that fullest version of themselves. I actually want to ask Kunda what your take is on the experience of being LGBT here, in that kind of transition from Zambia to the UK, and where you feel that there may still be constraints. I think you're muted, Kunda.
Sorry about that. I would say from the time I came to the UK, I feel a lot much better, more relief. I don't look over my shoulder because I have friends that are gay. They don't even seem like they care, you know. And I've learned to live like that as well. I'm open. I open up with everyone. I just tell them that I'm happy that I'm in the UK and they accept people that are in the LGBT community. Something you'd never even want to say where we come from, because where we come from, they'll beat you up, they'll put a tire around you and set it on fire, So we are afraid. Everyone who's there right now, even some of my friends that I know, they would not even want to discuss. So when I talk to them about it, that, you know what, there are places where you can go. I was just lucky that I happened to run away and found myself here. I didn't even know, when I came here, I didn't know, just someone said, go to the UK and you find freedom. It wasn't the least of my plans. I thought I would find ways. There are people that are trying to break through where I come from and talk to the government, and the government won't tolerate that. They'll say they're a Christian nation and they don't really want anything to do with that. And you'll be thinking, you're a Christian nation, you must love everybody else. But then the actions are different. They'd rather, let a thief go and penalize you, as put you in prison and torture you and make you a laughing stock, and it's really very bad. So coming here, I was under trauma, and I couldn't even talk very well. Even when I was at home office, the man kept on telling me, just drink some water, can I offer you this? And I started feeling some fresh air as I went on, having joined RABS, and I found that, wow, I'm not the only one, and everyone comes from a different country. And when Herbert, our leader, asks us to say, would you like to say something? I would always say pass, and eventually I started opening up, and everyone looks like, we're going in the same direction. So it's really something tremendous. I love the UK. It's brought some light, and I'm finding myself, I didn't even do music for some time, until when I met the Stellas and everyone. Then I said, but I can play, I can sing. And it was difficult to just come back. I was like, all right, let's hear you do something, I was with Daniel. Daniel, is vibrant. He's one of the people I work with in RABS. And we talk every day, and we just like, let's wait. It really inspires a lot. And we're looking forward to meeting, Yeah.
Thank you very much, Kunda. And I'm also very glad that you've managed to find your voice and your music making ability again. I really look forward to hearing you perform. Misha, I hope that answers some of the questions that you asked. Okay, I think that will probably be the last question for the day, because we've actually run over time. So all I want to say now is I wish everyone a happy Pride Month, wherever you are in the world, and hoping that you're celebrating it in your own ways. As part of the Pride Month celebrations for the Pink Singers, we have a number of talks coming up. These are public ones. So next Thursday evening, I'll be in conversation with Kakan Qureshi, and we'll be discussing the intersectionality between being LGBT+ as well as Muslim. It's a very interesting conversation, and I hope you will join us for that. Then on the 21st of June, this Monday, we'll be talking to the creation of virtual LGBT spaces with two people who have managed to create new spaces internationally online over the course of the pandemic. So I think that'll be relevant to some of the discussion that we've had about the closure of physical spaces. And that's all I want to say. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope you had an informative and useful time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cian, for setting it up and doing all the tech. It's amazing.